Farhana, thank you so much for joining us here today. I think this is maybe one of the most important events that the IPF has held since it was found 5 years ago, because this movement towards a more responsible fashion industry, I think, is facing a more precarious future than it ever has before because of global politics, the state of the market, the state of culture. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with you because you've not only had a front row seat to this climate movement throughout its evolution, really, but literally being in the room where things have happened, often making them happen. And I wondered if you could start by giving us sort of cliff notes of your career and talking us through how we got to this moment where we are today.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. Getting used to this seating position here. So I guess I became a lawyer very much by happenstance, by chance. Anyone who, thinks that they got to where they are as a result of some 5-year plan they had or their parents had or rebelled their way is not telling the whole story. We all have accidents, surprises, unexpected opportunities that build out and shape our character. So I got here because of a scheme that was put in place for inner London school children by Ken Livingstone, a Labour politician at that time, to get inner London school children into Oxford. And that's how I got to Oxford, which opened so many doors for me and made me confident enough to sit, in stages like this and to feel that I had a voice and I had things that were valuable to say. I then became a lawyer. I qualified in the 1990s just as environmental issues were really hitting the global stage in a good way. At that time, we had the success of something called the Montreal Protocol, which is a nerdy legal agreement, which essentially has been one of the most successful treaties of all time because it's actually closed the ozone hole. That was very formative when I was going to my very first Earth Summit in 1992. So I won't give a chronology of all of those years since 1992, but I became involved in the negotiations from 1991 onwards of the climate change regime, which consists now of 3 treaties: the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, which is still going, and then the Paris Agreement, which came in 2015. And in 2015, I wish I had been doing this work. And I've got on stage here something which Sarah asked me a question. She said, "How did you get into fashion?" And I said, well, actually, it was because Cameron Russell, who was the daughter of a friend of mine called Robin Chase, a brilliant woman who is an entrepreneur and set up Zip Cars, I had coordinated a group of women who were senior negotiators working in the UN in the negotiations running up to the Paris Agreement. And Robin had invited Cameron, who was a sort of supermodel and something very exotic and amazing for us nerdy scientists and lawyers and diplomats. And Cameron said, "Can I come to Paris and can I make little videos of you?" And she also then got Vogue to feature 13 women, including myself, in Vogue on November 30th, 2015. If you Google Cameron Russell article, "Make These Women Famous," we were the nerdy 13 women. And then I realized, oh my goodness, everyone I know reads Vogue or wants to read Vogue, and actually nobody reads the IPCC journals and the scientific things. And suddenly, I was famous, and the issue that I was working on was important. And I guess that was a really big aha moment for me to see the power and agency and role of things other than law, economics, diplomacy, and the UN. And I wish we had all had that aha moment a lot sooner, because your role is so important. And Cameron did go on to make these amazing 1 to 2 minute videos. And again, it was like, hey, how can you explain this really complicated issue called loss and damage that takes me an hour and a half to give a lecture on in 1 or 2 minutes, and 1.5 versus 2 degrees? So I think, that power of creativity, of someone having access to and saying, I can make short videos, I can be there, I can use my platform, my contact, my voice, my friendships with the world's top, makeup artists and designers to do this photo shoot. That was really, really helpful in, I think, getting a whole range of people interested and exciting in supporting the sustainability journey that you're all now on. So that was where I came to be involved. I did spend most of my time in a sort of like a pavilion, a little office, a temporary office in the Paris negotiations, really supporting the Minister of the Marshall Islands at that time, a really powerful and wonderful man who sadly passed away, called Tony de Broom. And the Marshall Islands is a tiny series of dots in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, literally in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it's most famously the place where nuclear weapons were tested in Bikini Atoll. And there's a massive nuclear dome. I acted for many of these small island countries in the last 30 years, and the nuclear legacy is just one more legacy of pollution, actually, and climate is now the next challenge for them. So I've had the perspective of always acting for those who are the most vulnerable to climate impacts, those who are fighting for justice, in this case, as the president of the Marshall Islands, a woman, the very first woman who'd done a PhD in the Marshall Islands, actually, Hilda Heine, said, Farhana, climate is the latest thing that's happening to us. We have been fighting for our cultural human rights, our independence as a country for centuries, and so we will be fighting and resisting all along. And so those are the kind of experiences that have formed me and shaped me, and I've had the privilege of acting for as I said, small islands and vulnerable countries, mainly in the last 30 years, and in the last 10, focusing a lot more on other sectors that, we forgot at the beginning, when very much science came, the scientists and the physicists and the meteorologists and the environment ministries tended to dominate the negotiations, and we thought on its own science would be enough, and we now know that it isn't. It's really about behavior change and reimagining and reconfiguring a completely new society and how we live, breathe, eat, dress in that society.
I think that's a really interesting point, because the story you told about 2015 and appearing in Vogue, I think that was a moment of incredible optimism, and a lot of people and companies and policymakers who hadn't necessarily engaged in a meaningful way with this topic suddenly started to opt in. It almost became cool. And 10 years later, we seem to be in quite a different point. How do you see that trajectory over the last 10 years, getting from that moment of optimism to this moment that feels quite challenging now?
Well, at the time, it wasn't a moment of that kind of optimism, because we didn't think we could have that deal, which was better than what we usually think is going to be the lowest common outcome. And Paris had come against the failure of negotiating a successor to the Kyoto Treaty. So it was literally born out of a huge collapse in the UN negotiation, a turning away from, global rules, a real determination by the small islands, for example, and other vulnerable countries in Africa, least developed countries, to not accept a 2-degree centigrade increase in global temperatures. So it came out of that determination that we would not allow that huge failure to define us. And that was the sort of gritty determination. And many of you may know and heard and have spoken, about Christiana Figueres, I think really embodied that sense that we're not going to allow ourselves to fail again, because we will be failing a huge number of people in the world, including our daughters. My daughter also met Cameron Russell. So these daughters were coming along, and I think the women were particularly important. We also had our share of, this network was called the Lionesses, but we had our share of lions, for sure. So we really made a global effort to come together. And I think that determination is still very, very strong, even though we've now had 2 periods of time in which the US has walked out of Paris. So obviously that happened with Trump won, he gave it 6 months, actually. In this case, it was the next day that he signed out of Paris. And I guess what I want to say is this is the third time for me in my personal career, spanning just over 30 years, that the US has tried to destroy, essentially, multilateral cooperation in this, especially focusing on the environment. Because the first time was George Bush, rejecting Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol, which had also taken us a decade to put together, universally signed onto by everyone. And then the US came along and tried to trash it and said, we are never going to sign it and we're going to be actually hostile to it. So in each time we've come through it, and I guess that's the point I feel I want to stress right now, that we did come through those bleak moments, those forces of inertia, and I think of anxiety and running scared and of business as usual. And I think all of them are much more visible and together now, because that is the dynamic that is fueling populations turning to demagogues and politicians like Trump and others. That anxiety that is there. We have come through these periods successfully by holding the line, by being faithful to our vision, by sticking to the facts, by creating a kinder world to ourselves and to the planet. And so I feel very much, that that's the message. If there's a message today I want to convey, it is hold the line. Don't feel, people are going to turn against the desire to wear clothes made in a better way, that are less polluting, that are nicer in terms of and support human rights, that are not made by workers who are suffering or who are being exploited. That is not going to be the case. That is a temporary blip, and this is an attempt to crush all the progress that we have been making for decades, and it will this time pass as a result of all of the work and all of the commitments that you all take forward and the energies that you take forward, and which came about, including from the Paris Agreement, that every, I think, industry and sector after Paris did go away and have that sort of aha moment and say, what can we do? And for me, also another moment in that way was I then joined Extinction Rebellion in 2018, really frustrated by the lack of progress. And I think that sort of also coincides with another wave of creativity, of new sectors, other people coming on board, because they realized politicians and politics and simply voting wasn't enough. We had to make changes. Everyone had to make changes in their everyday jobs, in their own finances, in their own consumption, in their own patterns, and also vote for the right people. So it wasn't just one or the other, it was both. And I think previously we'd very much relied on that expert policy government sort of model. So there is a lot of change happening, and we're going in the right direction, all of us.
I love that you've got some optimism here. And I also thought it was so interesting that, hearing your stories, actually, individuals really matter. What individuals who have a little bit of influence do can make a huge difference, which I think is very empowering probably for a lot of people in this room who may be feeling quite frustrated right now. You mentioned joining Extinction Rebellion and the need for cultural change and fashion's influence. I think one thing that's emerged over the last few years is the industry's really struggled to figure out how to talk to people about this, how to engage them, how to make people feel excited and also not seem inauthentic when essentially you're trying to sell more stuff to them. Do you see a way for companies to navigate that?
Yeah, I remember on one of these panels a few years ago, I think it was Nike and Adidas, said that they were actually hiding the extent to which their products were using recycled materials, because their research had shown that their customers weren't quite ready for it. And I thought, wow, you have to actually hide that you're doing something good, because it may not, sit well with the entire consumer base that you're sort of marketing at. So I don't think any of us, I don't have a sort of simple answer of how to get it right. I'm not a comms person. I'm quite a nerdy. I write books that are bigger than this. But, I urge you to find that way. I think there are such big trends happening. I have 4 children. two of them just don't buy new clothes. It's not because I'm mean and stingy with pocket money, I am, but, they also just prefer Vinted and getting, exchanging stuff and doing all sorts of things. They've really turned away from brands. The other two are not, actually. So it's like 50-50 in our house. I feel like we're representing the spread of opinion out there. But I think, our relationship with consumption is changing and needs to change very, very big time. And I think the fashion industry is very much part of that consumption-based society, which is why I've got the other book. And last time I was here, Aja Barber, who's written a book called Consumed, really tells the story of consumption, especially focusing on the fashion industries. It isn't just the fashion industry, it's everywhere. But I think fashion sort of represents, I would say, a pinnacle of it. I'm throwing that out there. So if we can change and shift the norms in fashion, actually we will have a massive change and it will reflect a societal shift. And that's what we need. We need these societal shifts to happen.
I'm going to ask you a nerdier question, which is about regulation and the legal environment, obviously, because you have a background as a lawyer. For the last few years, there's been regulatory momentum behind this. The EU has been moving forward to make the fashion industry more responsible. In the US, you had a lot of funding going into green efforts. You had states moving forward with different regulations. The UK has been a little bit slower, but there were moves to turn what had been voluntary action into requirements. In the US, those are now unlikely to go forward. In the EU, those are being watered down. And there are emerging legal risks for brands who do talk a lot about what they're doing around climate or what they're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. How dangerous is this for the movement?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a backlash. And I think there's no denying that is impacting, and creating inertia and confusion and stopping, what was happening from happening at speed and accelerate. And that's what we actually needed. We're not just on climate, but on biodiversity, on pollution, toxicity, plastics, you name it. The tipping points are all going in the other direction or have been passed. We're at a very dangerous moment. So we really couldn't, this really couldn't have come at a worse time. But at the same time, there's a massive pushback against this, which will happen. There's always, Newton, whereas there's an action, there's a reaction. And the reaction will be more beautiful, bigger, and more powerful. Trust me, I feel very solid on that conclusion. And you're starting to see it, despite the control that, some of the oligarchs, and they are at, let's call it that, there's never been a bigger concentration of power between those holding regulatory power and those holding media power as well as holding wealth. So that concentration is so on show now. It couldn't be, there could be no better campaign that I could devise to show you the concentration and perversion of our democratic and free market ideals than what you've got now. And again, resisting that is up to everyone. Resisting it through your workplace, joining local action groups, going along to shareholder meetings, go and buy a share. That's affordable for everybody, pretty much, who's working and in this room. And support those actions that are happening in the street, at the ballot box, at MPs, your members of Congress. That is starting to happen. Use your rights in the labour movement. The labour movement, which has taken 300 years to give us basic civil and political rights and safety, health and safety rights, has been under attack for decades. Why? It's because it presents a huge threat to those in power, and that's why those rights are being eroded. So I think, whatever takes your fancy and whatever you feel comfortable with, and ideally a little bit discomfort is good for you, so push yourselves to do that. And I think that everyone has that. In terms of this regulatory inaction is also going to be is a risk. So doing nothing is a risk, and I think that obviously speaking as a lawyer, litigation of any and every kind will increase. You know, no one's going to sit around thinking, oh yes, we better wait until the next election, which may or may not happen. You know, who knows if elections will be abolished or manipulated further. So don't wait for that. I don't think they'll, you know, CEOs, CSOs, the C-suite, you know, expect far more action to be happening over the next few years as the counter trend is going to take shape and have force too. And I certainly, you know, will be helping and supporting, you know, innovation in legal tactics, in movement building tactics, in all sorts of protest tactics. Those will dominate. And politicians do listen in the end. And we're lucky we are still in the UK, we are still in the EU. They may be, you know, slowing down, but they haven't abandoned or jettisoned anything yet. And they know they can't really afford to do that.
What do you see as the levers that are going to be effective for change over the coming years, given the complex political environment?
Behavior change, you know, and that's what politicians are not good at, because they don't want to be seen, you know, as the nanny state or to be interfering too much. They've been afraid of using things that, you know, require behavior change. In COVID and lockdown, we had massive behavior change, and they took that because there was a direct health emergency which had fatalities attached to it. So political systems do respond with direct, you cannot go here, you cannot stop there, you must wear a mask, you're not allowed to do this, X, Y, and Z. But they don't tend to do that, and that, you know, for other issues. And so we must shift, I think, the comfort levels around that. We must make things more mandatory than voluntary. So we've had, you know, as I said, I've been active for three decades or more, and about half of that time we relied and campaigned really only for voluntary approaches, and only for market-based sort of mechanisms, you know, a tax here or a fee there. We didn't require mandatory disclosures, mandatory labouring, mandatory technology standards. So yeah, the word mandatory I love. You know, so we must make things mandatory, and that's actually fairer for everyone in the end. And we must give politicians the comfort levels to do that by showing that consumers in the end will accept the changes, and it will reduce, you know, not just pollution, but result in a better world. And they've lost a bit of courage about that. So again, sticking to our values, sticking to what you know to be true is really important. And I think, you know, people, another sort of initiative, a group, some colleagues of mine have started, it's called Insider Movements. So we know that there's lots of people within an industry who are usually, frankly, unhappy with it. They know that their company is greenwashing or not doing enough and could do better. They're tired of that company saying, well, so-and-so's not doing that, so I'll also not do that, even though I could do that. So I think within your own industries, please stop using the laggards as your benchmark. You know, you choose the companies that are doing the best. Choose those who are going beyond greenwashing. Stick to your integrity and have the courage to do that. Go and find colleagues. I'm not saying, you know, whistleblow and lose your jobs. I'm just saying within workplaces, a culture sort of develops where cynicism is sort of accepted and where inertia sort of becomes accepted, that, you know, actually I'll just leave, or I'll set up something else, or I'll find something else. I mean, and that culture is really pervasive, and it's across all professions, including law, including everything else. And again, I'm really grateful to activists, young people, new movements for holding accountability. So that's a massive lever for change. You are the lever for change. You know, your own life, whether it's your work life, your home life, your consumption choices make a difference. And I think I wouldn't underestimate the power of consumption. It's a norm we want to displace. We're not just consumers, for sure. But it is a very powerful lever. And of course, you're seeing that now, whenever there's a recession, we're encouraged to kind of do our duty to the economy and go and spend, eat, buy, and actually we want to make sure that what we're doing with our consumption is different. And so, choosing the right products, the right suppliers, making choices, buying vintage or secondhand is really important.
I think one big headwind that has emerged within the fashion industry is a belief that after Paris, that I think was quite prevalent, that this was what consumers want, has been really tested over the last decade, because companies that went out there and sort of said, oh, we've got this much more sustainable product, didn't get rewarded. Sometimes that was because the product was not that much more sustainable. But you've also seen companies like Shein become incredibly successful. And so in a increasingly challenging market, when companies can't say, we'll be rewarded by consumers if we do this, and they care, where's the momentum for companies to keep doing this coming from?
Yeah, I'm not, I don't have a simple, here's a magic bullet answer. I think we have to make what we're doing more attractive, keep battling away, and saying and exposing, the shortcomings of those other businesses, of Shein, of Temu, of the fact that you can buy the product, but if you try and return it, it's going to a landfill straight away. It isn't a return. It is, a cost, and exposing who is paying that cost. And most of the time, the cost is being paid by poorer communities in poorer countries through landfill and disposal, through originally the production, which wasn't safe and toxic anyway. I'm talking to people who are involved in the life cycle of fashion is hugely polluting, whether it's water consumption or toxicity, and in all cases. And that's what Aja's book is about: coloniality and understanding that actually there's still huge disparities on who bears the costs of business as usual and those toxic models. And we just have to keep exposing that in everyday life and doing our best. I guess, I also feel being an imperfect activist and living in an imperfect world is better than not trying at all. So making steps, all of us, to green, be clean, be more humane, and clean up our supply chains and make them more ethical. We're not going to get it right from day one. It's going to take decades. So let's not set ourselves, impossible standards that we feel that we're failing all the time. We're not going to correct these practices. We can make inroads. And all of us, myself, I've, from that lovely photo that was taken in Vogue, which I was so sad to let go of, but in the end I had to, because I had jet black hair in that photo, and I really felt I could not use that as my photo anymore, the Vogue photo from 2015. We have to make changes. We have to accept that actually I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, whether it was my mother or my grandmother or my father who made the changes that were necessary, the campaigners who made, when I came to this country in 1973, it was on the back of the Equality Act and the Sex Discrimination Act. I had nothing to do with those. I remember reading those at law school and I thinking, this is cool. And we had activists who fought for and campaigned for the fall of apartheid. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall. We had the whole of the Soviet Union collapsing. So these massive, massive changes I've experienced in my lifetime, I feel like we didn't even anticipate that we would see the end of apartheid, and we did. And that's on the basis of generations of people taking that work forward. And we must see ourselves in the green community as part of a community that is actually a very young community. We're only about 30, 40 years old, not that old, really. Okay, some organizations have been around for about 100 years, but not that many in the conservation, environment, sustainability field. These are very young fields, and all of the treaties reflect that. All of the laws reflect that. They're all enacted, from the 70s onwards, basically. So in my lifetime and yours, I know that there are many young people. So please don't feel that the change isn't happening because it's not happened overnight or is not happening fast enough. I wish it was happening faster. I wish there was less destruction, there was less toxicity that was being released. I wish we weren't on the threshold of crossing the 1.5 benchmark that we had hoped and had set. And again, it's not a given. So it isn't a given that we will breach that permanently just because we breached it 1 year. It is a given if we do nothing every year from now on. So change is happening. It's happening more slowly. It's happening in fits and starts. There is backlash against that change because we've been successful. Why have they tried to kill the treaty again? Because it was successful and real change was happening. And again, one of the things I was very proud of is I came up with this idea of having the net zero by 2050 goal and then enshrining it in the Paris Agreement. And thousands of other people worked for that. And obviously, it's only 10 years old, this goal. There's going to be confusion, vagueness, litigation, greenwashing. Yes, of course, we expect that to happen. But the fact that it's taken hold and it's a proper metric is incredible. And so science-based targets, trying to get more integrity into the system is where we're at. And so don't be disappointed and don't think everything's terrible and going backwards. It's a backlash and it's a temporary one. And with our resolve, we can make sure that it doesn't take hold.
I think that's a fantastic point. Unfortunately, we've run out of time because we could keep going forever. But I think that's a fantastic point to end on, that says that just because this moment might seem dark, all is not lost. So bear that in mind for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and there was a quote, I think, when Trump was first elected by a woman who's a Sikh US activist called Valerie Kaur, and she said, "What if this is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb?" And it was really lovely. I love that as a mother as well, that it's an awakening, it's a birth. Don't feel that this moment is the death. And death too is part of life, and it means that there is a birth of something new that will happen. So I choose to believe that this darkness is the darkness of the womb, and the birth of something new is going to happen.
Thank you so much, Farhana. It was amazing.
Awesome.